Hello, everyone. After some time, we are back with another football episode. I sat down with James Kitching, an Australian sports lawyer and executive whose career has taken him from the Asian Football Confederation to FIFA, where he served as director of football regulatory. And he helped lead major reforms to the global transfer system, including the FIFA Clearing House, which we will certainly talk about. Now he manages his own football consultancy, the FC, where he advises organizations worldwide on governance, regulation, and integrity in sport. He also just returned from the FIFA World Cup, so I'm quite curious to talk to him about that as well. So let's jump straight into it. James, welcome on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
You have a very interesting career journey, which I found personally interesting. So maybe you could do just a short intro.
Sure. Look, my background is I have a legal education, but while I was studying at university in Australia, I'm from Adelaide in Australia, I also joined the executive committee of my amateur, we call them soccer teams here, but my amateur football team. Within 1 year, I became the club secretary, and I always thought I wanted to work in the sports industry. My career as a lawyer took me to the Australian Financial Services Regulator. So I worked on white collar crime matters, and then after a couple of years, decided to go overseas, do a master's degree, and that master's degree led me into the sports industry. And my first role in sport was actually in and around my professional background. I was asked to assist an investigation happening at the time at the Asian Football Confederation around the former president who had been accused of some financial misappropriation. So someone with a white collar crime enforcement background with also a passion and understanding of football, knowing what the buzzwords were in the sport, really assisted in that. And, from there, I guess the door was open to me within the industry, and I stayed in Asian football for 5.5 years. And then a couple of years after leaving Asian football, then got headhunted and moved to FIFA as the director of football regulatory. Now, now I manage my own consulting business back here in Australia, advising the industry on governance, regulation, strategy, and lucky enough to have a couple of different positions on boards of sports organizations as well. And one of them, I think might come up in conversation is I'm a supervisory board member of the FIFA Clearing House, a payment services provider which works in the football transfer system. And I'm also, a board member of two Australian sporting organizations as well. So hopefully that wasn't too long, but, gives a short background, for everyone that's listening.
It's really fascinating. And as we just discussed before we started recording, you just came back from the World Cup. I actually don't even know personally, like I think anyone who attended, because it's very far. And so can you share something with, I'm sure also some of our listeners would be curious, like how that experience was?
I've been lucky enough through work and pleasure and access to actually attend 4 men's World Cups and at least I think now 3 women's World Cups. And this one was very different to many others, just in the size and the scale. You were very, I think, isolated in each city that you were in. Traditionally, at a World Cup, you sort of, in the past, you would either follow your team and that was it, or if you were going to be there for a long time, you would stay in one major city and then travel. But just because of the size and scale of this World Cup, you needed to be quite nimble in how you were moving. One of the great things for me at this World Cup was the US as a country, obviously, as a country of immigrants, and you have 48 teams at the World Cup, and I would say every one of those teams would have had a significant diaspora in the country. So you had such a big following for every team, notwithstanding that you had some really smaller countries or organizations or territories, I should say, in the World Cup, which was great. And seeing that passion come through was sensational. But it was it was a football World Cup, so it wasn't that much different to other World Cups that I've been in, just in scale of the operation. I don't envy the staff that had to work on it. It would have been quite challenging, no doubt.
That's really cool. And if you go back to business, you mentioned your private consultancy. Can I ask, maybe you don't have to name any clients, but just in general, who do you consult? And is it mostly clients in Australia or do you work globally?
The FC predominantly consults to international clients, international federations, leagues, regional federations, or confederations, as they might be called in some instances. So really, those organisations that are at that governing level. We also do consult to further down the so-called sports pyramid, clubs, individuals, etc. But primarily at that governing body level is where our clients are, and internationally.
And you mentioned that you are also a supervisory board member of the FIFA Clearing House, which is a Paris-based payment services provider. What does that do exactly, this entity? I believe this is a 100% owned subsidiary of FIFA.
Sure. So when I was the director of regulatory at FIFA, we had, as I joined, we had just decided as an institution to establish the clearinghouse. And one of my primary roles while I was an employee at FIFA, while I was the regulatory director, was to set up the clearinghouse and establish it within the transfer system. And subsequently, when I left FIFA as an employee, one of the agreements that we made was that I would be a representative on the supervisory board of FIFA. So the FIFA Clearinghouse, as you mentioned correctly, payment services provider, licensed in France, and a wholly owned subsidiary of FIFA, correct? Effectively, its role is to, in simple terms, act as an intermediary within within the transfer system, but an intermediary which ensures that international financial regulation and the due diligence that's required in these types of transactions is occurring when money is being distributed between clubs. Now, the clearinghouse was established originally to handle different types of transactions, and the first type of transaction that FIFA started with the clearinghouse was the distribution of what we call training rewards. So FIFA has two different types of, in the finance sector, you might call them even trailing commissions, development fees, different language you might use. But in football, we call them training rewards. So it has two different types of training rewards whereby a player that either becomes professional for the first time or moves at a young age as a professional, or a third type is where a player who is subject to a transfer fee. Those three different types of moves within the transfer system, whether it's signing a first professional contract, whether it's moving as a professional at a young age, or whether you're moving with a transfer fee, they potentially generate a training reward. And prior to the introduction of the clearinghouse, the way that a club that trained a player was able to receive the reward from the inevitably bigger club that had triggered one of those three types of financial compensations was they would have to basically go and knock on the door of that club and say, hi, Manchester United, hi, Real Madrid, hi, PSG. I'm a 7th division club from the Czech Republic. I trained this player from the age of 12 to 14. Can you please pay me what I'm owed? And a 7th division club from the Czech Republic maybe doesn't have respectfully doesn't have a CEO, a general manager. It's run by volunteers. And the last thing they're doing is tracking all of the players that, came through the club 15 years, 20 years before, because, they're focused on putting their teams out, running the game, doing all the administrative things that, like I said, I was a secretary of my club when I first, left university. All of those things you do as a volunteer. And so what actually happened was in that system, it was estimated there were hundreds of millions of US dollars, of euros that were lost, that were simply not paid to those training clubs, because the FIFA rules were and are still quite strict. you have 2 years effectively to claim the money that you might be owed, and then, that money that you're owed then is extinguished. You're unable to claim it anymore. So the clearinghouse was established in small part and a big part, because this is its primary focus right now, to close that gap and to automate the payment from the big clubs to the small clubs, or the big clubs to the big clubs, but to automate those payments of training rewards. So, a Czech seventh division club will never, and hopefully will never, have to go through that process of going to knock on the door. That will get done for them by the system, and then, as long as the clubs within that clearinghouse framework are meeting all of the what I would call pretty standard compliance requirements that you'd find in any other major transaction that occurs globally, then the clearinghouse in itself in the middle then will ask the club that owes the money to pay the money into the clearinghouse, and then it will distribute that out to the training club. So in that way, the training club doesn't have to take on that administrative burden to ask for that money.
So the way this is technically done is that the clearinghouse maintains some sort of a database of all football clubs. They monitor all the transfers, and whenever there is a trigger, they will automatically inform the seventh division Czech Republic club about their claim, and then they will organize it accordingly.
Well, there's a great explanatory video on the FIFA website about it, but you've either watched it or you've effectively almost got it 100% right. There's two parts to the clearinghouse. There's the licensed financial entity, which is, as I mentioned before, domiciled in France, based in Paris, which handles the payment and compliance end of the transaction. But there's also the first part, which is the trigger, the word you used. That trigger is actually detected and handled by FIFA TMS, which is FIFA's transfer matching system, which is FIFA's own internal software, which runs the football transfer system and is handled by FIFA directly. So FIFA handles the first part, which is determining the clubs that are entitled to receive money and the amounts. And once that process is finished, and through that process, the clubs that are involved in that potential transaction, they also have the ability to appeal any decision to the Court of Arbitration for Sport in case they think maybe FIFA has misjudged the amount they are owed, or their national federation has got their what we call an electronic player passport, which has all the training data of the players. Their national federation has got that wrong, for example. Once that process is finished, then those financial allocations are sent to the clearinghouse, that then goes and undertakes the financial compliance side of the process. So yeah, you're absolutely right. There's a automatic trigger. That trigger is validated by FIFA staff, and then once that validation is done, then the clearinghouse does the financial compliance and the payment on the other side.
And the financial compliance then concerns what exactly? Do they check the ultimate beneficial owner of the football clubs that receive the money, or do they check, I don't know, sanctions exposure, potential political exposure, this kind of things?
It would be no different to any other major transaction that occurs globally in the finance sector. So exactly what you're talking about. It's the sort of the basic DD KYC stuff that happens. Who is the UBO? What is the source of funds? Is this in a sanctioned country, etc. I'm not going to say the basics, but because it's never basic, but it's the type of stuff you'd expect in any kind of normal transaction.
Okay, understood. And there's one major topic, or at least major in the part of the world where I am based, in the European Union. We have this, as of I think May 2024, the European Union decided that professional football clubs will be in scope of its AML CFT regulation. And I actually had I think it was about 2 years ago, I had a conversation on our podcast with our mutual friend Nick Raudensky, former investigator at FIFA, who
Yeah.
we were discussing this topic with. And then a couple of months ago, I also spoke to Niels Appermont, who is a professor of sports law at a Belgium-based university. And it was a very interesting conversation because Belgium and I believe Bulgaria are the only two EU countries that had already included the football sector in the AML CFT regulation. So we were talking about the challenges that Belgian professional football clubs have been facing. But obviously, I want to ask you about your views on the regulation itself, but I'm also curious about the premise of this regulation. Do you think that it is justified? Do you think this is needed?
Look, these are personal views. I'll make that clear. And Belgium was always one which stood out to me when I was working at FIFA and even before FIFA, because they were forced by the industry effectively, and what happened there to make changes, and not forced by the industry, but forced by government because of the behavior within industry. One of the striking things for me when I became director of regulatory at FIFA was, particularly from a compliance and a white collar crime background as well in Australian financial services, that the transfer system in itself was effectively one of the biggest unregulated markets within the world, just because of its transnational nature. Now, I say unregulated, not to say that there isn't regulation, because FIFA very famously has what it's called the regulation on the status and transfer of players, which regulates, when a player can move, the special conditions around transfer windows, and around the types of things that can go into contracts or not, the consequences if a player contract is breached, or if a club fails to pay a transfer fee. But what you don't find within those regulations are sort of basic things, I think, that you would find in other financial markets. And it's hard to talk about it as if it's a market, because we're talking about humans, right? We're talking about, we're not talking about futures or shares or stocks or bonds or whatever. We're actually talking about registrations of individuals. That's what's being traded here. It's the right to register James or Philippe at my national federation and then use their special skills. But you don't have, and the regulations still really don't have that sort of framework around what should be, what should be, I think, sort of some basic financial controls. And so the clearinghouse in itself, when it was introduced, it indirectly creates those controls now, right? Because anyone that's using the clearinghouse needs to pass a compliance assessment. They need to have those things which you talked about before, be very clear that FIFA is aware who your UBO is, FIFA is aware the source of funds, you're not subject to sanctions. There aren't any sort of financial crime red flags in your background, which would make the bank, or in this case the clearinghouse, say we're not going to transact with you because the AML CTF risk is too high. But the reality is the nature of the football industry and how the transfer system works is that these transactions, some of them for 9 figures, get done in a matter of 2-3 days. They're done very quickly. The paperwork is, template. Those types of checks that would normally happen, if you're talking about a big M&A transaction or some other kind of large purchase, etc. The lawyers and the accountants are making a bunch of money on the side too, doing all the type of work that that the compliance specialists that that would normally occur in any case. That traditionally just doesn't happen in football because of the nature of how the transactions occur. Personally, I think that's such a huge risk to such a big industry. And as you mentioned, there have been cases in the past of nefarious people and organizations taking advantage of the transfer system and the lack of what I would call financial controls in the system, because the regulatory controls, the football regulatory controls, are good in terms of ensuring that everything matches in the transaction. You know who the clubs are. You know what's the subject of the transaction. You get declarations as to the finance involved, but then you don't have that sort of next step, which is what the clearinghouse indirectly does in the case of transfer awards. So the EU legislation, I think, correctly reflects the fact that football is a high risk sector, just simply because those types of controls that you'd find in any other sector, really, when it comes to the level of transactions we're talking about, and level not just in the number of the number of the final transfer fee, but also the volume and how quickly it gets done as well. The fact that there is limited compliance there, that creates huge risk. And I know that, to be quite frank with you, that several countries in the EU, I won't name them, but many of their big banks won't touch football clubs. They just simply won't take football clubs on as clients because the risk profile is too high. Because the sector is, doesn't have that kind of control. And there's an added layer of that as well when it comes to the amounts of money that the sector pays to football agents, and how football agents are, also, even I'd say this generally. I'm not saying football agents as a whole, and there are some outstanding agents and a lot of outstanding agents that do well for their clients, but are maybe not set up in the same way as well as football clubs in terms of the due diligence and compliance and the all the types of things that need to be going on in the transactions that they're undertaking on behalf of their clients or with their clients. So the clearinghouse is a first step to introducing that kind of framework within the football regulations, but there is a gap there. And so personally, I believe given the risks involved in the sector, that it doesn't surprise me. It didn't surprise me when it was first, announced a couple of years ago that football was a sector that would be included in the new rules, and I would welcome it. So yeah.
And do you have any insights on some football clubs, European football clubs that would be then in scope of this legislation? Because I have read recently, I think I shared with you this article. It was an interview with Bruna Skezo. I believe this is how you pronounce her name. She is the head of the European Anti-Money Laundering Authority, and she was, I think, talking about some tour of Europe that she recently conducted, and she was meeting people that AMLA would be regulating, and she was specifically saying that, I think I have this quote here, football sector may not yet have fully understood that it needs to be ready by 2029, which is when the legislation come in effect. So what is your impression of the football clubs?
Well, I think that the reality probably isn't far from what she's saying, to be honest, in terms of the compliance requirements maybe not being specifically on the radar of clubs. But without saying something I don't know, it would surprise me if football regulators are not across this and are dealing with this now in anticipation of 2029. I think I say this as a humble Australian, but the reality is the epicenter of world football is in Europe, and the vast majority of the money that transacts in the football transfer system is in Europe, and so it would surprise me if there wasn't attention and dedicated servicing being done of the legislation in advance of it coming into force. It might not be the clubs directly; it could be their leagues, it could be their federations, it could even be their local supervisors in their countries as well. Yeah.
And last question, James. So this is obviously an EU initiative. Do you think that this has any potential to kind of spread more widely around the world if it's successful?
It's an interesting one because the reality is, and I say this again as a humble Australian, but also having experienced different areas of the world, both in my professional life and also in my consulting life now, the reality is there is a very diverse range of sophistication in football. I think it would be extremely challenging if this was implemented globally on a equal sort of understanding of how sophisticated football is in Europe compared to many other parts of the world. I think many other parts of the world, sort of even the basics when it comes to things you want to see in compliance, like do you have a bank account? Literally, do you have a bank account? Are some things you might find as a challenge, or a bank account in the name of the club, as a basic example. So in that respect, it would be surprising to me if it did. But at the same time, centrally, FIFA certainly does ensure that transfer rules are handled uniformly on a global basis. A great example is what football now knows colloquially as the Bosman Rule. The Bosman Rule was a European issue. Ultimately, it was something that was handed down by the European Court of Justice, where Jean-Marc Bosman took his club to court, and to cut it short, the court effectively said that the club can't demand a fee after the contract's expired. You're an employee, just like just like any other worker whose contract is finished. You're free to move when your contract is finished. The international football rules at the time said that if your contract expires, your club is still able to retain you and ask for a transfer fee. So what the European court decision then did was, in Europe, it created the scenario where anyone whose contract expired, they could leave for free, but FIFA's rules still reflected for the rest of the world. They could still do something like this. And so FIFA had to find a global solution, which it implemented on a worldwide basis. And that came after 5 years of negotiations with the European Commission and UEFA and FIFA as to how that would look. And that's when we got the Bosman Rule and the new transfer system in 2001. If this does ultimately go to a global level and finds its way into the FIFA regulations framework, then potentially you might find it extended on a global level. But as I mentioned, I think we are probably a couple of decades away from having that same level of sophistication across the world. In some instances, in some countries, maybe even never, because again, it goes back to I think what I said at the top originally. Europe is the epicenter of the transfer system and world football, and the vast majority of money flows out of Europe. But yeah, globally, I think it would be a big challenge, my friend, I'm afraid.
All right. Time will tell. But I'm afraid I will have to let you go. You have a lot of travel behind you, but I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. It's been really interesting, and yeah, I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate you having me on and talking about a topic close to my heart. Appreciate it.